Then the game proceeds to not even try, even though we've gotten to the point even this early. They took advantage of the mechanics in really interesting ways, and sometimes I like cheesecake, but if I sat down and ate an entire family-sized cheesecake by myself, I'd want to puke afterwards.
Hey bub, I've been looking over the scripts for these games, and I seem to have encountered a problem. You wrote 3 scripts for the same game.
What?
No, I'm serious. You wrote 3 scripts for the same game. Mega Man 1, 2, and 3.
Ah, I get it.
A motherfucker I may be, but this motherfucker just played Mega Man 3. I'd continue this rhyme if I gave a shit, but Mega Man 3 really disappointed me. I once called this my favorite Mega Man game, but now that I've played it this time for I believe the 5th time, suddenly the shine has come off the apple and has been replaced by the unforgiving cold dullness of hate. Okay, that's a bit dramatic, but I was very much disappointed by this game. Believe it or not, this was actually the first Mega Man game I ever played. Back during my original NES game playing days in the late 90s, early 2000s, I had this game and only occasionally played it, which is why I only remembered it when I popped it in and suddenly felt something very dormant rising in my gut. The same thing that happened when I popped in Robin Hood Prince of Thieves for what I thought was the first time. And the funny thing is, if you go and read anything about the development of Mega Man 3, you'll learn that it was surprisingly an absolute shit show. The lead project supervisor left Capcom, which meant Keiji Inafune took the reins of the project. So in the first game, he was an artist, the second game, he was one of the upper tier designers, and now he's the lead supervisor. I feel like he was working on a long con. I'm disappointed he didn't keep going because he'd have owned Capcom by Mega Man 5 and would have been supreme ruler of the universe by Mega Man 9. Maybe that's why they made so many. But in spite of the turbulent production and even Keiji Inafune saying he didn't like the game, Mega Man 3 came out in mid-1990, about 2 years after Mega Man 2, to fairly universal appeal, critical and commercial, and as a matter of fact is another one of the few games in the Mega Man IP that sold over 1 million copies. It sold much less than Mega Man 2, but still has nothing to scoff at. It's such a weird game, and everything about it just screams good intentions somewhat mishandled, and is a key example of the old maxim, you can always have too much of a good thing.
So let's take a look at Mega Man 3, a popular contender for best Mega Man game. However, that is under serious question now. You betrayed me, Mega Man!
I have to admit, one of the things I really liked about Mega Man 2 was the surprisingly cinematic intro, with the story being explained and the long pan to Mega Man at the top of the building, but now I can't help but feel the downgrade because this game opens right to the title screen. No opening sequence, just the title, and not even a good one. It's of course not a big deal, but let that set the tone for the game to come. What this game entirely fails to present is even the slightest bit of context, which sucks because there are some things that should have been established in this game. Dr. Light created a giant robot called Gamma, which was meant as an international peacekeeping robot, aka the unintentional weapon of mass destruction to surpass Metal Gear. Are we sure Dr. Light isn't maybe the slightest bit evil? Either that or he's the most inept person in the universe. Apparently he may have also been building this with Dr. Wily because they decided to work together mysteriously, but once again that's never shown. This game also introduces a few characters such as Rush the dog or the morally ambiguous Proto-Man, so there are plenty of things to tell you other than the generic Dr. Wily evil, build robots, stop Dr. Wily, but then the thought process going into this seems to be, who cares, you know how this goes. Then the game proceeds to not even try, even though we've gotten to the point even this early into the series where we've seen where the games can get with a little bit of effort, but none such effort exists here. Of course the backstory could be explained in the manual, but I don't own the manual, and 99.9% of people who own this game don't own the manual, so let's not get that confused, okay? So once again, this game falls back solely on the gameplay, and for what it's worth, this game actually does play really well. So once again, this is a fairly standard Mega Man game where you jump and shoot through a series of hazards. You got a bunch of varied enemies and a bunch of varied platforming challenges to flow through. Each of these levels traditionally exist in 3 parts where you fight a boss at the end of these levels and beating them will grant you their power. The controls are really smooth, the platforming is really responsive and generous, and overall this game feels much better to play than your average platformer on the NES. There, we got the explanation of what the game is for those who've never played a Mega Man game, and what does this game do differently than the previous games? Well, there are a few major innovations to Mega Man 3, and one of them is so significant that it makes the gameplay here miles ahead of the first 2 games. One word.
Slide.
If you press down and jump, you'll slide along the ground on your ass. On a basic level, this is utilized in terms of level design with low-level ceilings that you have to slide under, which is a standard addition. They give you a hazard, then introduce the solution to that hazard, so it may not seem special, but what this move does is it gives you an instant momentary boost to your movement speed, so it makes it much easier to maneuver, and especially to get out of the way of attacks, because you can now slide out of the way quickly as opposed to before when your only recourse was to saunter away and hope not to get hit. This is huge because now with one of your major handicaps partially removed, i.e. your slow walking speed, the game can start introducing hazards and enemies that incentivize faster movements and attacks, meaning this one addition speeds up the game as a whole by at least 20%, so it raises the pace, and as a result the gameplay can become more exciting and inventive. It's a small addition that makes a big difference. Another change that's more or less irrelevant is the numbered abilities this time around are now all performed by the robot dog companion that goes by the name Rush.
And before you ask, you cannot pet the dog. Much to my chagrin.
There are 3 basic functions that he serves. You can use Rush as a spring to get to high places, you can use his submarine state to travel underwater, and you can use his flying state to fly over hazards. Much like the similar abilities from 2, you unlock these throughout the game, and they vary in usefulness. You have the submarine mode, which is borderline useless other than exactly one instance to my memory, and even then. The spring is situational, but at least it has its moments, and the flying pack thing is borderline overpowered, especially this time because it's fully controllable, so it's quite trivial to skip entire sections of the level. That said, it's a fine enough addition to the game from last time, and I'm always game to have animal companions on board, even if it's an artificial animal. The other most major thing that they added was the addition that you can now carry up to 9 E-tanks at any one time. They don't go away after you get a game over, and most of all, they carry over when you type in a password. In fact, you can get a bunch of E-tanks just by guessing the placement, like put a red ball on A6 and nothing else and see what happens. The results may surprise you. Otherwise, there aren't too many new additions. I could talk about how plugging in a controller to the second port and fiddling around with those buttons will have some weird effects, but I didn't even know about this until researching the game. It's weird, but I suppose it adds replayability, and if you really feel the need to give yourself some advantages in gameplay, it's there if you need it, but by the point I found out, I'll be frank, it was a little bit too late, but once again I'm getting ahead of myself. Level design wise, I found this game to be surprisingly good. They took advantage of the mechanics in really interesting ways, and sometimes there are some flat boring areas in levels like, for example, the entirety of Hardman stage.
Whoa, Hardman? Keep it PG, dude.
But there's more interesting design and set pieces in pretty much every other level, and even then, the general basic platforming is well made and really fun with some really interesting level-based gimmicks, like the floating tops that change your position, or the launching tops, all of which are in Top Man stage. Who says they aren't getting their top money's worth? You got the really clever platforming sections in Sparkman stage, including my favorite, where you have to jump across pits with platforms that raise when you step on them, requiring picture-perfect timing. The Egg Sacks in Gemini Man stage, the entire pure platforming air section in Snake Man stage, it's all great. Of course, there are also some obnoxious set pieces like the disappearing block sections in Magnet Man stage, the falling blocks of shit in Spark Man stage that fall just fast enough that it's nearly impossible for you to get by without taking some damage, the dropping needles in Needle Man stage, the part in Spark Man stage where you're completely overwhelmed by enemies with the raising platforms, proving that even the most fun mechanics are ruined with Ball's design. As a matter of fact, one thing I noticed is that for every fun section, there's another equally obnoxious section, but there really is some good gameplay here, even if it is just for the most basic of sections, because the gameplay itself is so great, and the levels themselves are only looking better and better. They took the best parts of the first and second game and found a happy medium, so the environments look coherent and real while also utilizing negative space really well, and so they make sure to keep the detail high and try not to repeat the same thing too often. The interiors look great, and the exteriors also have enough detail that they all look great, and thankfully not the least bit repetitive for the most part. The sprites, the environments, the animations, for the limited color palette and resolution all look great. I'd say all they really need to do is refine the art style and they'd have something really special. Now, shifting over to the topic of boss fights, this mysterious figure called Proto Man will fight you from time to time, and it's honestly a pretty easy fight, but it's a fine enough way to mix things up from level to level. His patterns are piss easy to predict, but he also dies in few enough hits that you can just tank it. It's funny that this mini-boss is on top of the returning smaller mini-bosses and the regular bosses, so this game has a lot of bosses. In terms of real bosses, this time around we have a selection of 8 bosses in Hard Man, Spark Man, Needle Man, Snake Man, Top Man, Gemini Man, Magnet Man, and Shadow Man.
And from what I understand, apparently, Mega Man 2 and 3's boss designs were all based off of fan submissions from Japan, and they were picked from literally thousands upon thousands of fan submissions. And it's probably a good thing that it was Japan only, because if you let it open to America, then you probably end up with things like Shit Man, Retard Man, N-Word Man, Hitler Did Nothing Wrong Man, You name it.
I think Gemini Man is a good example of a good boss fight because the whole idea of having to split your focus into 2 targets is a neat idea. Magnet Man is really fun because he's very basic but incentivizes these interesting, intricate movements and timing while attacking, and Snake Man with the long circuitous pattern for you to memorize and work around, but some other ones are kind of obnoxious, like Hard Man's 2-pronged attacks and stunning function, or Shadow Man with his obnoxious, useless weakness. So once again, the boss selection is a mixed bag, and as ever, there's no reason to do anything but follow the circle of weaknesses, because otherwise you're just making your job harder for yourself. That said, they did do something interesting and break the circle for 2 instances, meaning you're forced to use your regular buster for at least 2 of the bosses, and that's a very interesting way to incentivize different approaches to gameplay. That said, the powers you get from them are even more of a mixed bag than before. The absolute cream of the crop of uselessness is the Gemini Laser, because you can fire 1 shot and only 1 shot, and it bounces a few times before it dissipates, the result being that you'll be waiting around for several seconds if your shot misses while you wait for another chance to attack. I think if you switch to another power after you shoot, the laser will automatically disappear, but to be honest, A, I never really thought about that, but also B, there's still a chance of hitting it even after you initially missed, so otherwise you'd just be wasting weapon energy, either way making this easily the most awkward weapon in the series thus far. But on the other end of the spectrum, you have the Shadow Blades, which aren't as overpowered as the Metal Blades, but are made with the same idea in mind. It's a thing that can shoot in 8 directions and can be useful in many situations, although the range is balls and there isn't much ammo, so it balances out. The top spin power-up can only be activated in the air and has about 1 second of use, so there's absolutely no reason to use it in any circumstance. It's used for one thing and one thing only, the final boss, and the magnet power-up is really good because in certain circumstances it will auto-track to certain enemies, so once again there are weapons that are useful in some circumstances and some that are less than useful, but they're still learning from their mistakes and are getting better every time. One thing I haven't really had a chance to mention is one of the things that makes the music in the Mega Man series so special. Unlike many NES compositions that are just a series of flat, sometimes shrill tones, so the music tends to be unpleasant at worst, mediocre at best, Mega Man soundtracks are multi-layered with harmonies going alongside the major tones, and so it actually has compositional quality that transcends the 8-bit tones, which is why, as I've probably said before, Mega Man soundtracks are so iconic. It actually uses traditional compositional qualities that exist outside of the hardware, implements them, and creates some of the best tunes on the NES. This time around, the major heavy hitters are, for one, the epic intro music in spite of the bland presentation of the intro itself. Sparkman stage. Spikeman stage. And probably my favorite in the entire game, Wily Fortress 1. So there's a lot to like about this game, but the overall point is that this game was great, but was still ruined for me. I was digging this game thinking it was the best one I've played around the end of the 8 main levels. Little did I realize I was only about halfway through the game. You see, I was starting to get worn out by Mega Man 2, which had 14 levels, 13 if you don't count the final boss as a stage, but I count every line on the way to Dr. Wily as an individual level, but Mega Man 3 kicks it up a notch with 17 individually sectioned off levels. You have 8 regular levels, 4 repeated levels where you fight approximations of the bosses from Mega Man 2, then 5 Wily stages, and the repeated 4 stages are longer and more difficult than the regular stages, so they might as well count as 2 stages each, the result being that this game feels way too bloated. Now what do I mean? Surely bigger is always better, right? Giggity goo. In theory. That said, I like cheesecake, but if I sat down and ate an entire family-sized cheesecake by myself, I'd want to puke afterwards. Yes, Mega Man is good, and this game from a gameplay standpoint is the best it had ever been, but I've said that Mega Man has a shelf life because these games aren't so deep that they can go on for more than a few hours at best. These games are essentially 2 mechanics stretched out to breaking point. Jump and shoot. You can only do that for so long in so many ways because then it just becomes repetitive. I used to praise this game because with the addition of the Mega Man 2 bosses, it felt like 2 games rolled into one, but as I am now, all it does is make the latter half of the game arduous to get through. Granted, maybe this wouldn't be so bad if it were new content, but no, we're playing slight variations on levels we've already played to fight bosses we've already fought before. Playing what amounts to a ROM hack of a level I've already played does not a good addition make. So yes, it is possible to have too much of a good thing, and after playing for level after level, I'm not left wanting more. I'm left wondering when it's all gonna end. I had to play this game in 2 sessions, that's how bad it got. This game was so close, and had it cut the fat and maybe went straight to the Dr. Wily Wily stages right after the main 8 stages, this could have easily been my favorite classic Mega Man game because mechanically and level design wise, this game is great. So that said, we've now come to the final stretch of the game, and if you need any more evidence as to why this game went on too long, usually the Wily stages are the greatest hit showcase of all the levels up to this point, but we already had that with the 4 bonus stages, so Dr. Wily gets away with Dr. Light's latest creation, simply called Gamma. Hold up. What? Wily? Wily with an E? What the hell? That's not right. Well, anyway, at this point you're of course faced with some of the hardest challenges in the game. I wouldn't necessarily say the hardest, but some of them. And in fact, some of these levels are just a linear series of challenges in small rooms, which are usually straightforward. Spikes, disappearing blocks, chompy buggers. All put together in competent and interesting ways, but are still fairly straightforward. I can't help but feel all the inventiveness and energy was put forth into the 4 bonus levels, but to its credit, straightforward isn't frustrating, where the level design in the 4 bonus levels are kind of frustrating. Overall, the level design here is actually quite good, and had it been in a different game, I probably could have talked about it in a much more positive light, but alas. So from here we have several bosses. We have what's called the Turtle Master, which is a hilarious name. You have to shoot the turtles it drops while avoiding them, as well as the rushes of air that come towards you from the vents all around you. There are a few moving pieces here, so it's a pretty exciting boss fight that utilizes multitasking. Then you have the return of the Rock Monster. I think this time he's officially been dubbed the Yellow Devil, and this time he's actually much less obnoxious than he was before, and also has a slightly more goofy design than before. Hey. He also moves slower, has more varied attacks, and front to back is a more pleasant boss than before. Then you have the triangle of Mega Man clones. This one's balls because there doesn't seem to be a way to tell which of these 3 Mega Mans are the one you're supposed to attack because only one is real and will take damage and the other 2 are non-corporeal, and then from there you have to fight another boss rush, or should I say recycled attrition rush. Once again, boss rushes have never been good, and these things are just starting to wear out my patience, and considering we've already had to fight all these bosses already, as well as all the bosses from Mega Man 2 on top of that, this is just getting ridiculous. Between these, the Yellow Devil, and all the bosses from Mega Man 2, this game has just turned into a series of recycled content, and considering how overlong this game is, it's kind of baffling at this point. Finally, we make it to the end game, and Dr. Wily Stage 1 is pretty easy. He's in what looks like a spider tank, and you have to blow up the turret at the bottom, which opens up the top. Kind of a major design oversight, but never mind. This is actually kind of balls because for some reason the indication of whether or not you're damaging him is kind of vague. I only found out I had to damage the turret through trial and error. Then you have to blast his face, but first you have to wait for him to come down low enough, or you have to use one of the tools to get yourself higher. It's not an overly difficult boss, and in fact I think it's a fair challenge. Then it's revealed that dun 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 it was a fake Wily. Then you get to the real final boss and have to face Gamma.
Okay, time out. So, okay. Dr. Light creating a giant doomsday robot to keep the peace worldwide, I can buy. Him working with Dr. Wily to create said robot, okay, it's a bit contrived, but, you know, I'm still with you. But here's the thing. Dr. Wily stole that robot. That robot. How in the flying fuck did he steal that robot?
It's literally the size of a factory. This isn't some phone or like a laptop. You don't just take it and walk out. The amount of manpower it would take to get this would bankrupt Wily. The reason I'm banging on about this is because, all things considered, Gamma's a chump. You just need to climb his body and use the top spin power up on his head. Then the game's over. Wily and Mega Man both get crushed to the end. Not actually. Mega Man gets saved by a mysterious figure that turns out to be the character we've been fighting this whole time, Proto Man. The end, along with a rush of character portraits. Getting small explanations of each one of these robots and their purposes. Still makes me question why basic utility robots needed this kind of firepower, but hey, it's something. Hold up. Former assistant to Dr. Wright? You mean Light? Dr. Light? Jesus Christ, translation team, what the hell? Also, I know it's Dr. Wright in Japan, but we're not in Japan, are we? Finishing on this beautiful shot.
Heyo. And that was the bloated mess, Mega Man 3.
This game could have been great. It could have been the best of the best. It had finally evolved the gameplay to a serviceable level. It had finally done enough with itself to implement levels of depth, but unfortunately, its length and repetition really kills it. Maybe this is a problem unique to me, maybe it's Maybelline. If you don't mind how bloated this game is, then I can easily recommend it, but for me, it's a single fatal blow that brings this game down to a rank of D. Which doesn't necessarily mean that this game is bad, merely that it falls short of the series' baseline quality.
So you know, we've been subject to some rather unfortunate pit traps, but maybe just maybe, now that we're past all the growing pains, Mega Man can strike out and make something truly great. Or maybe I can just stick 9-inch nails into my face. I said face.
This video was brought to you in part by my lovely patrons. I thank you for your continued support. If you want to become a patron for TGX, the link is in the description.